The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a royal messenger whose polished boots clicked against the worn stone floors of father's estate. Mira pressed herself into the shadow of the servants' stairwell, watching through a crack in the door as Elena received the cream-coloured parchment with its golden seal. "The grand royal ball," Elena breathed, her voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for prayer. An invitation to the palace. Mira's heart clenched with something she refused to name. Want, perhaps. Longing. The kind of foolish desire that had no place in the chest of a bastard daughter who spent her days scrubbing floors and mending Elena's cast-off gowns. "Of course, you'll be coming with me," Elena said, turning toward the stairs where Mira hid. "I'll need someone to attend to my needs." The words hit like cold water, not as a guest, as a servant. "I wouldn't want to presume," Mira managed, stepping from the shadows with the careful deference she'd learned over 20 years of living in the spaces between acknowledgement and invisibility. Elena's smile was sharp as winter frost. "Oh, but I insist. Every lady of quality brings her personal maid to such events. It would be improper for me to go unattended." Personal maid. The title tasted like ash, but what choice did she have? Father barely acknowledged her existence on good days. Elena held what little security Mira possessed in her perfectly manicured hands. "Thank you for the opportunity," Mira whispered, hating how the words felt like swallowing glass. The week that followed blurred into a frenzy of preparation. Elena required 17 different fittings for her gown, a confection of emerald silk that cost more than most families saw in a year. She needed her dancing slippers broken in just so, her jewellery cleaned until it caught every possible ray of light, her hair practised into increasingly elaborate styles. Mira's own preparation consisted of Elena tossing a bundle of blue fabric at her feet. "This will have to do," Elena said, not bothering to look up from her correspondence. "It's 3 seasons old, but serviceable enough for your position." The dress had been Elena's once. A pale blue silk that might have been beautiful before time had faded it to the colour of forgotten sky. The bodice was too tight across Mira's chest, the sleeves too short for her arms, but it was finer than anything she'd ever worn, and when she caught her reflection in Elena's full-length mirror, something in her chest fluttered dangerously close to hope. "Don't get ideas above your station," Elena warned, catching her looking. "You're there to serve, not to be seen." The night of the ball they travelled in separate carriages. Elena rode in father's finest coach, resplendent in emerald and gold, while Mira huddled in the servants' wagon with Elena's luggage and the lady's maid who would dress her hair. "First time at the palace?" asked Martha, the older woman who'd served Elena since childhood. "First time anywhere like this," Mira admitted, watching the countryside roll past in the gathering dusk. Martha's eyes held a mix of pity and warning. "Keep your head down and your mouth closed. The nobility don't like to be reminded that people like us exist." "People like us." The words followed Mira as the wagon wheels clicked against cobblestones, carrying her towards something that felt impossibly vast and dangerous. Like standing at the edge of a cliff and being asked to jump. The royal palace rose from the darkness like something from a fairy tale, all soaring spires and golden windows that seemed to hold captured starlight. Mira had seen it from a distance her entire life, a distant gleam on the horizon that might as well have been another world. Now, passing through the massive iron gates, she felt the weight of every story she'd ever been told about her place in the world. The servants' entrance was a narrow door tucked behind the kitchens, invisible from the main courtyard, where noble carriages discharged their passengers in rivers of silk and jewels. Mira followed Martha through corridors that hummed with activity, kitchen maids carrying silver platters, footmen in pristine livery, the organised chaos of an event that had taken months to plan. "Stay close," Martha murmured as they navigated the maze. "It's easy to get lost your first time." But when they reached the antechamber where Eleanor waited, Mira found herself dismissed with a wave of her half-sister's gloved hand. "I won't need you until later," Elena said, already surrounded by other ladies adjusting each other's jewels and offering compliments sharp as knives. "Find somewhere to wait, quietly. Somewhere to wait." Mira wandered the servants' corridors until she found a small alcove near what Martha had told her was the ballroom's service entrance. Through a gap in the heavy curtains, she could glimpse slivers of golden light and hear music that made her chest tight with unnamed longing. The Grand Royal Ball was everything the stories had promised and more. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across walls, hung with tapestries that probably cost more than Father's entire estate. Ladies in gowns like spun moonlight danced with gentlemen who moved like poetry given human form. The orchestra played melodies that seemed to reach directly into Mira's soul and twist. She pressed closer to the curtain, drinking in details she knew she'd treasure later in the cold silence of her tiny room, the way the light caught on a tiara, the sweep of a lady's skirt as she turned, the easy confidence of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged in beautiful places. "Absolutely stunning, isn't it?" The voice came from behind her, low and warm and entirely unexpected. Mira spun, her heart hammering against her ribs, to find a man standing in the shadows of the corridor, tall, impossibly broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that caught the distant ballroom light. He wore simple dark clothing, a servant, perhaps, or one of the palace guards. "I'm sorry," she stammered, stepping back from the curtain. "I wasn't supposed to be looking, I was just—" "Dreaming," he finished, and something in his voice made her breath catch. "There's no crime in that." Heat crawled up her neck. "I should go. I'm supposed to be waiting for my lady." "Your lady." He said it like the words left a bad taste in his mouth. "And what do you think of all this grandeur?" Mira glanced back toward the golden slice of ballroom, visible through the curtain. "It's beautiful, like something out of a story." "But not your story." The quiet understanding in his voice nearly undid her. "People like me don't get stories like this. We watch from the shadows and try not to want too much." "What if I told you," he said, stepping closer, "that you're wrong about people like you?" Something electric passed between them, a golden thread of connection that made no sense and every sense at once. Mira's breath caught as warmth spread through her chest, foreign and impossible and so very dangerous. "I should go," she whispered, but her feet wouldn't move. "Should," he repeated, like it was the most interesting word he'd ever heard. "Not want to." Before she could answer, Elena's voice cut through the corridor like a blade. "Mira, where are you? I need my fan, and the clasp on my bracelet needs adjusting." The spell shattered. Mira stepped back, remembered who she was and why she was here. A servant, a shadow, nothing more. "I have to—" "I know," he said quietly, "but remember what I said about people like you being wrong about themselves." She fled toward Eleanor's calling voice, but the warmth from their brief encounter lingered in her chest like captured sunlight. Dangerous, impossible, entirely too much like hope. Elena's demands came swift and relentless after that first glimpse of the ballroom. She needed wine, not just any wine, but the specific vintage from the northern vineyards that the Duke of Westmere preferred. She required delicate pastries from the royal kitchens, arranged just so on silver plates. Her gloves needed powder, her fan needed mending, and through it all, Mira navigated the palace's maze of corridors like a ghost, trying to remember how to be solid. "Hurry!" Elena snapped each time Mira returned, breathless from racing through unfamiliar halls. "I can't be seen without proper attendance. What would people think?" What would people think? The words followed Mira through servants' passages that seemed designed to confuse, left at the tapestry of hunting hounds, right past the portrait of some long-dead king, down stairs that led to more stairs until she was thoroughly, completely lost. She stood in what appeared to be a minor hallway, holding Elena's forgotten shawl and fighting back tears of frustration, when a door she hadn't noticed opened onto moonlight and the whisper of night air. A garden. Not the formal garden she'd glimpsed from windows, but something smaller, more intimate. Moonlight painted everything silver, the curved stone benches, the fountain at the centre where water fell in gentle cascades, the climbing roses that perfumed the air with something sweeter than any ballroom could offer. And standing beside the fountain, as if he'd been waiting for her to find him, was the man from the corridor. "Lost again?" he asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice even in the darkness. "Entirely," Mira admitted, clutching the shawl like armour. "I was trying to find the kitchens, but everything looks the same, and the servants keep giving me directions that make no sense, and—" She stopped, realising she was babbling to a stranger. "I'm sorry, I don't usually— this isn't usually how you what? Talk to people." The admission slipped out before she could stop it. "I'm not very good at it." He moved closer, stepping into a patch of moonlight that turned his dark hair silver and made her breath catch. "You're talking to me just fine." "That's different. You're—" She searched for the right words. "You don't look at me like I'm supposed to disappear." Something shifted in his expression. "Who looks at you like that?" "Everyone." The word came out smaller than she'd intended. "It's not their fault. I'm nobody important, just a bastard daughter who's good for fetching things and staying out of the way." "Is that what you believe?" His voice held a quality she couldn't name. "That you're nobody important?" The question made her chest tight. "It's not about what I believe, it's just true. People like me don't dance at balls like this. We serve those who do." He was quiet for so long that Mira wondered if she'd said something wrong. When he finally spoke, his words made the world tilt sideways. "What if I told you that you're the most beautiful woman I've seen tonight?" The golden thread she'd felt in the corridor flared to life, spreading warmth through every part of her until she felt like she might float away. "I'd say you need to have your eyes examined." His laugh was low and rich and did dangerous things to her pulse. "My eyes work perfectly." "You can't know that. You can barely see me in the dark." "I can see enough." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell something warm and clean, like cedar and rain. "I can see that you have kind eyes, that you carry yourself like you're trying not to take up too much space, that when you looked through that curtain earlier, you weren't envious, you were wonderstruck." Her breath caught. "You were watching me." "I was, and I kept thinking about what it would be like to see you in there, dancing with the rest of them." "I don't know how to dance." The words escaped before she could think better of them. "Not really. I mean, I've seen it done, but I've never—" He extended his hand, palm up in the moonlight. "Would you like to learn?" Everything in her that had been trained to know her place screamed at her to refuse, but the golden warmth in her chest whispered something different, something that sounded dangerously like yes. "Here?" she whispered. "Why not here? The moon is our chandelier, the fountain is our orchestra, and there's no one to tell us we don't belong." Slowly, as if her hand belonged to someone braver, she placed her fingers in his. The contact sent electricity racing up her arm, and from the way his breath caught, she thought he felt it too. "Just follow me," he said, drawing her into the proper position, with hands that were gentle but sure. "Feel the rhythm." At first, there was no rhythm except the hammering of her heart against her ribs. But as they moved together in the moonlit garden, something magical happened. Her body learned the language his was speaking. Step and turn, dip and sway, until she forgot she didn't know how to dance and simply let herself be carried by the music of fountain water and night wind. "There," he murmured as they turned in a slow circle. "You're a natural." "I feel like I'm dreaming," she admitted, overwhelmed by the impossible lightness in her chest. "Like I'm going to wake up and be back in the servants' hall, and this will all have been my imagination." "Does it feel like imagination?" His hand tightened on her waist, steadying her as they swayed. "No," she whispered, "it feels like flying." They danced to music only they could hear, turning in slow circles while the rest of the world continued its revelries beyond garden walls. For the first time in her life, Mira felt beautiful, not because of what she wore or where she stood, but because of how he looked at her, like she was something precious he'd been searching for. "I don't even know your name," she realized, as the dance gradually slowed. "Does it matter? Tonight? I suppose not." But even as she said it, something in her wanted to know everything about him. His name, his dreams, the story behind the gentleness in his hands. The distant sound of voices shattered the moment like glass against stone. Elena's voice, sharp with irritation, calling her name from somewhere inside the palace. "I have to go," Mira said, stepping back so quickly she stumbled. His hand shot out to steady her. "When will I see you again?" "I don't. This was a mistake. I shouldn't have—" "Should," he said, just like before. "Not want to." But Eleanor's voice was getting closer, and panic rose in Mira's throat like floodwater. She pulled free from his gentle grip and ran, clutching the forgotten shawl to her chest like a shield. Behind her, she heard him call something, but she didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't let herself think about the warmth that still lingered where his hands had touched her. She found Elena in the antechamber, surrounded by other ladies, and wearing the particular expression that meant someone was about to suffer for her inconvenience. "There you are," Elena snapped, snatching the shawl without thanks. "Where have you been? I sent you for this an hour ago." "I got lost," Mira mumbled, not trusting herself to say more. "Of course you did. Honestly, I don't know why I bother." Eleanor adjusted the shawl around her shoulders with sharp, irritated movements. "Lady Catherine has been asking about my lovely bracelet, and now I look like I can't even manage my own servant properly." The other ladies tittered behind their fans, and Mira felt heat crawl up her neck. But underneath the familiar shame, something new flickered. The memory of kind eyes and gentle hands, of being called beautiful by someone who looked at her like she mattered. "Pull yourself together," Elena hissed, as they prepared to return to the ballroom. "You look like you've been running wild in the gardens." If only she knew. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of tasks and errands, but Mira moved through them with a secret burning bright in her chest. Every time she caught a glimpse of the ballroom's golden light, she remembered moonlight on water and the impossible feeling of dancing on air. Every time Elena's voice cut through her thoughts, she remembered another voice, warm and low, telling her she was beautiful. When they finally returned to the servants' quarters near dawn, Mira lay on her narrow cot and stared at the ceiling, her body still humming with the memory of the dance. She could still feel the warmth of his hand on her waist, still hear the gentle timbre of his voice asking when he would see her again. She wouldn't see him again, of course. Whatever magic had happened in that garden belonged to the night, not to the harsh light of morning where she would return to being nobody, and he would return to wherever men like him belonged when they weren't appearing in moonlit gardens like something out of a fairy tale. But as she drifted towards sleep, Mira allowed herself one small, dangerous thought. For one perfect dance, she had felt like someone who deserved to fly. 3 days passed before Mira found the courage to return to the garden. 3 days of Elena's increasingly sharp demands, of pretending the dance had been nothing more than a beautiful dream, of lying awake at night, feeling the ghost of gentle hands on her waist. She told herself she was only going to collect herbs for the kitchen, a perfectly reasonable task that had nothing to do with hoping to see dark hair and kind eyes in the moonlight. The cook had mentioned needing fresh rosemary for the evening meal, and the palace herb garden was said to be the finest in the kingdom. Dawn light painted the garden in soft pastels as Mira slipped through the door she now knew led to magic. The fountain looked different in daylight, smaller perhaps, more ordinary without moonlight to transform it into something from a fairy tale. But the roses still perfumed the air with sweetness, and her heart still fluttered with dangerous possibility. "You came back." She spun toward the voice, nearly dropping the small basket she'd brought for the herbs. He sat on the stone bench beside the climbing roses, fully visible now in the gentle morning light. dark hair that caught golden highlights from the sun, broad shoulders beneath a simple white shirt, hands that she remembered being impossibly gentle. "I needed rosemary," she said quickly, then felt foolish for the obvious lie. "Of course." His smile was warm and knowing, and entirely too understanding. "The kitchen gardens are on the other side of the palace." Heat crawled up her neck. "I got lost again." "Convenient how you keep getting lost in the same place." She couldn't argue with that, so instead she busied herself examining the herb plantings along the garden's edge. "You're here early." "I work early shifts." He stood and moved closer, careful not to crowd her. "What about you? Don't ladies' maids usually sleep past dawn?" "Elena doesn't need me until mid-morning, and I like the quiet." She glanced at him, then back to the herbs. "Peaceful." "Lonely too, I'd imagine." Something in his voice made her look up fully. "What do you mean?" "Always serving someone else's needs, always watching from the shadows. When do you get to want things for yourself?" The question hit deeper than it should have. "I want things." "Like what?" The simple question opened something inside her chest, a longing so vast and unnamed that she'd never dared examine it closely. "I want to read without having to hide. I want to walk through beautiful places without apologizing for being there. I want—" She stopped, realizing how foolish she must sound. "Go on." "I want to matter to someone," she whispered, the words escaping before she could call them back. "Not because of what I can do for them, but just because I exist." He was quiet for so long that embarrassment began to crawl up her spine. She'd said too much, revealed too much of the desperate hunger that lived beneath her careful obedience. "You matter," he said finally, his voice rough with something she couldn't identify. "You don't know me." "I know enough." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "I know you're kind to servants who give you directions even when they're wrong. I know you look at beautiful things like they're miracles instead of entitlements. I know you dance like you've been waiting your whole life to fly." Her breath caught. "You barely know anything about me." "Then tell me more." And impossibly, she did. Over the next hour, as dawn melted into morning and the garden filled with birdsong, Mira found herself talking to this stranger like he was an old friend. She told him about the books she borrowed from Father's library when no one was looking. Poetry mostly, stories about brave women who changed their fates. She told him about the small tower room where she went when Elena's cruelty became too much, how the view from the window made the world seem bigger and more possible. He listened like her words were important. More than that, he asked questions that made her think, made her realize she had opinions about things she'd never been asked to consider. "What's your favourite poem?" he asked as they sat together on the stone bench, carefully maintaining proper distance, even as something electric hummed in the space between them. "Probably the one about the girl who becomes a constellation," she said, then felt foolish. "I know it's childish, but I like the idea of becoming something bright and permanent, something people look up to." "Not childish at all." His voice held a quality she was beginning to recognize, the tone he used when he was about to say something that would shift her world slightly off its axis. "I think you already are something bright, you just haven't realized it yet." The compliment sent familiar golden warmth through her chest, but before she could respond, the sound of voices from inside the palace reminded her that the world beyond the garden still existed. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "Eleanor will be wondering where I am." "Will you come back tomorrow?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. "I don't know if I should." "Should," he said, exactly as he had the first night. "Or want to." She met his eyes, saw something there that made her pulse race. "Want to. Then come back." The next morning she did, and the morning after that. Their meetings became routine, stolen hours when the rest of the palace still slept, conversations that ranged from profound to playful, the slow building of something she didn't dare name. He brought things sometimes, a book of poetry she'd mentioned wanting to read, fresh bread from the kitchens, still warm from the ovens, small gifts that spoke of attention paid to her casual words, of someone who listened not just to what she said, but to what she didn't say. "Where do you go when you're not here?" she asked on their 5th meeting, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. "Work," he said, which wasn't really an answer. "What about you, when you're not fetching things for Elena?" "Dreaming, mostly." The admission slipped out easier than it should have. About being someone else, someone brave enough to speak up when people are cruel, someone who belongs in beautiful places. You belong here. In a garden at dawn when no one else is around, that's not the same as belonging. Isn't it? He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. When you're here, with me, do you feel like you're pretending to be someone else? The question made her chest tight. No, I feel like myself, the version of myself I might be if I was brave enough. Then maybe the problem isn't that you don't belong. Maybe it's that you've been taught to believe you don't. His words followed her through the day, echoing in her mind as Eleanor's demands grew increasingly unreasonable. A different tea service. New ribbons for a gown she'd worn only once. Fresh flowers arranged just so in her chambers, then rearranged when the first attempt wasn't perfect. "You're distracted," Elena observed on the 6th day, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Clumsy. What's gotten into you?" "Nothing, my lady," Mira said carefully, focusing on folding Elena's scarves with perfect precision. "Don't lie to me." Elena stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You disappear for hours in the mornings. You smile at inappropriate times. Are you meeting someone?" Terror shot through Mira's veins like ice water. "I collect herbs for the kitchens. The cook requested." "The cook has plenty of kitchen staff to collect herbs." Elena's voice could have cut glass. "Try again." "I enjoy the quiet morning air," Mira said, which was true enough to sound convincing. "It helps me think clearly for the day's tasks." Eleanor studied her face for a long moment, looking for cracks in the careful mask Mira had learned to wear. Finally, she stepped back, but her expression remained suspicious. "See that your morning walks don't interfere with your duties," she said coldly. "And remember your place, sister. Some dreams are too expensive for people like us to afford." The warning sent a chill down Mira's spine, but it wasn't enough to keep her away from the garden the next morning. If anything, Elena's cruelty made the gentle sanctuary more precious, the quiet conversations more vital. "You look troubled," he said, as she approached the bench where he waited with a small leather-bound volume. "Elena suspects something," Mira admitted, sinking down beside him. "She's watching me more closely." Something flickered across his expression. Anger, perhaps, or protective instinct. What did she say? That some dreams are too expensive for people like me. The words tasted bitter. She's not wrong. She's entirely wrong. His voice held an edge she'd never heard before. "Dreams aren't luxury items, Mira. They're not distributed based on bloodline or bank accounts." The way he said her name made something in her chest flutter dangerously. She'd told him her name days ago, but hearing it in his voice still felt like a gift. Easy to say when you're not the one who'll face consequences for reaching too high. What consequences? The question came out sharper than she'd expected. What's the worst thing that could happen if you stopped apologizing for existing? Elena could convince father to throw me out. I'd have nowhere to go, no references, no skills beyond attending to someone else's needs. The fears she'd carried for 20 years poured out of her. I'd end up in the streets, or worse. At least here I have a roof over my head and food to eat. So you'll trade your entire life for security? Some of us don't have the luxury of choosing adventure over survival. They sat in silence after that, the easy comfort of their previous meetings strained by the weight of reality. Finally he spoke, his voice gentler than before. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have pushed." "You're not wrong," she said quietly. "I am choosing security over living, but when you've spent your whole life being told you're worth nothing, it's hard to risk losing the little nothing you have." "You're not nothing." The words came out fierce, almost angry. You're brilliant and kind and brave enough to meet a stranger in gardens when you should be sleeping. You're curious about the world and gentle with people who don't deserve your kindness. You're everything good about humanity wrapped up in someone who's been convinced she's worthless. The golden warmth in her chest flared so bright she felt dizzy. Why do you care? You don't owe me anything. I care because someone should, because the world is a better place with you in it, and anyone who can't see that is blind. She turned to look at him fully, seeing something in his expression that made her pulse race. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. For a moment, she thought she might let him. Then the palace bells began to chime, marking the hour, and reality crashed back over them like cold water. "I have to go," she whispered. "I know." But he didn't move away, didn't break the connection crackling between them. "Mira?" "Yes. Tomorrow, same time?" She nodded, not trusting her voice, and fled toward the palace doors before she could do something that would change everything forever. The second evening of the grand royal ball arrived with all the ceremony of a coronation. Word had spread through the palace that neighbouring kingdoms' royalty would be attending, princes seeking advantageous marriages, dukes displaying their eligible daughters, the cream of noble society gathering to witness what promised to be the social event of the decade. Elena had spent the entire day in preparation, cycling through 3 different gowns before settling on midnight blue silk that made her look like captured starlight. Mira had watched her half-sister transform into someone magnificent and untouchable, each layer of jewellery and cosmetics building a wall between Eleanor and the rest of the world. "Tonight is everything," Eleanor murmured as Mira fastened the clasp of an emerald necklace worth more than most people's homes. "Prince Adrian of Westmere will be in attendance, along with Duke Corwin's heir. This could change everything for our family." Our family. The word sat wrong in Mira's chest. Eleanor had never included her in family plans before, except when those plans required someone to serve. "You'll need to be particularly attentive tonight," Elena continued, turning to examine her reflection from different angles. "I can't afford any mistakes." "Of course, my lady." "And Mira?" Elena's voice carried a warning that made ice form in Mira's stomach. "I trust your morning walks have cleared whatever foolishness was distracting you. Tonight is not the time for daydreaming." The threat hung in the air between them like a blade. Mira nodded, not trusting her voice, and helped Elena into her silk gloves with hands that barely trembled. An hour later, Mira stood in the servants' corridor outside the ballroom, dressed in the palace's formal servant livery, a plain black dress with white apron and cap that marked her status as clearly as a brand. The borrowed blue gown from the first night was packed away, deemed inappropriate for Elena's elevated plans. "You'll be serving refreshments during the formal presentations," Martha explained, handing Mira a silver tray polished to mirror brightness. "Stay near the walls, keep your eyes down, and speak only if spoken to directly." Mira nodded, though her hands felt numb around the tray's handles. Through the doorway she could see the ballroom in its full glory, hundreds of nobles in jewelled finery, crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light across walls hung with golden tapestries. The orchestra played music that seemed to lift the very air, and everywhere she looked, people moved with the easy confidence of those who had never questioned their right to beautiful spaces. "Remember," Martha added quietly, "we're invisible unless they need something. That's how we stay safe." Invisible. The word echoed in Mira's mind as she took her position along the ballroom's edge, tray balanced carefully in hands that remembered dancing in moonlight. She watched Elena take her place among the other eligible ladies, a vision in midnight silk that drew appreciative glances from every man in the room. The formal presentations began with trumpet fanfare that made Mira's chest tight. One by one, the most beautiful and accomplished women of the realm were announced to the assembled court, each one a potential bride for the princes and dukes who watched from the raised dais at the ballroom's far end. And there, seated on a throne that caught the light like captured stars, was the man from the garden. Mira's tray rattled in her hands as the truth hit her like a physical blow. The broad shoulders she remembered, The dark hair, the gentle hands that had taught her to dance, all of it belonged to someone so far above her station that their morning conversations felt like a mockery of everything she'd allowed herself to hope. He wore a crown of gold and sapphires that caught the chandelier light and declared to every person in the room exactly who he was and how impossible her foolish dreams had been. The Alpha King, the most powerful man in the realm, surrounded by advisers and nobles who hung on his every word. When he shifted in his throne, the entire court's attention followed the movement. When he smiled at something a duchess said, Mira watched a dozen young ladies practically swoon. And she had told him about her favourite poetry, had danced with him in a garden like they were equals, had almost let him kiss her. The humiliation was so complete she felt dizzy with it. Lady Eleanor of House Blackthorn, the herald announced, and Mira watched her half-sister glide forward with perfect grace. The Alpha King's attention turned toward Eleanor, polite and attentive as she curtsied with practised elegance. Mira moved through the crowd like a ghost, offering wine to nobles who barely glanced at her, each step carrying her closer to the dais, where Impossible sat on a throne and smiled at women worthy of his notice. She told herself to stay in the shadows, to keep her head down, to remember Martha's words about invisibility. But when she reached the nobles gathered near the royal platform, muscle memory made her lift the tray toward a gentleman who gestured for wine, and found herself looking directly into familiar dark eyes that went wide with recognition. The crystal goblet slipped from the nobleman's fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a cascade of wine and glass that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet ballroom. Time stopped. The Alpha King half rose from his throne, his gaze fixed on her face, with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare before hundreds of witnesses. She saw the exact moment he took in her servant's dress, her position, the silver tray that declared her status to anyone with eyes. The silence stretched until Elena's voice cut through it like a whip crack. "How clumsy!" Elena's laugh carried across the ballroom, bright and cutting. "I do apologise, Your Majesty. That's my half-sister, the bastard daughter. She's still learning proper behaviour around her betters." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to destroy what little dignity Mira had left. Whispers rippled through the assembled nobles, and she felt the weight of hundreds of curious, dismissive or pitying gazes. "She actually thought she belonged here," Elena continued, her voice carrying clearly in the awful silence. "Can you imagine? A base-born servant girl with such pretensions." More laughter joined Elena's, the kind of cruel amusement that came from watching someone else's humiliation. Mira felt heat crawl up her neck, her face burning with shame so complete she thought she might faint. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was seeing the expression on the Alpha King's face. Shock, yes, but underneath it something that looked dangerously like pity. He knew exactly what she was now, knew that every conversation, every gentle touch, every moment of connection had been built on a lie of a mission so vast it made her previous life seem honest by comparison. "She's been sneaking around the palace gardens," Elena added with vicious satisfaction, "probably throwing herself at stable boys or kitchen workers. You know how these common girls get ideas above their station." The final blow landed with surgical precision. Mira watched understanding dawn in the Alpha King's eyes, not just about her status, but about their meetings, about the magnitude of her presumption in accepting his attention when she was nobody, nothing, a servant who had dared to dream herself worthy of a king's gentle hands. She managed exactly 3 steps backward before her courage shattered completely. The silver tray clattered to the floor as she turned and ran, pushing through the crowd of nobles who parted before her flight, like she was something contagious. Behind her, she heard Elena's voice raised in false concern. "Oh, the poor thing! She gets overwhelmed so easily. I really must speak to Father about finding her more suitable employment." Mira didn't stop running until she reached the servants' quarters, where she collapsed on her narrow cot and sobbed with the kind of desperate grief that came from losing something she'd never really had. The garden meetings, the gentle conversations, the way he'd looked at her like she mattered, all of it had been built on the lie of not knowing who he really was. She was exactly what Elena had called her, a base-born servant girl with pretensions above her station. And now the entire royal court knew it, including the one person whose good opinion had come to mean everything. The Alpha King had seen her as she really was, nobody important, nobody at all, and the pity in his eyes had been harder to bear than all of Elena's cruelty combined, because deep down, in the part of her heart she'd protected with morning conversations and moonlight dances, she'd started to believe she might be worth something after all. Now she knew better. The silence in the ballroom stretched like a taut string, ready to snap at the slightest touch. 500 nobles held their collective breath as the Alpha King rose from his throne, his movement causing a ripple of uncertainty through the assembled court. The crystal chandelier above cast fractured light across his face, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the vast room. "Stop!" The single word held absolute authority. Conversations died mid-sentence. The orchestra fell silent. Even the servants frozen along the walls seemed to hold their breath. "Find her!" the Alpha King commanded, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with an intensity that made several ladies step back. "Find the lady who just left." Elena's face went white as bone. "Your Majesty, surely you don't mean—" "I know exactly who I mean." His voice could have cut glass. "Guards, search the palace, respectfully, and when you find her, tell her that her king requests her immediate presence in the throne room." Murmurs erupted throughout the ballroom like wildfire. Princes exchanged glances heavy with political calculation. Duchesses whispered behind jewelled fans. Elena stood frozen among the other eligible ladies, her midnight silk gown suddenly seeming like funeral attire. "Perhaps there's been some mistake," Duke Corwin ventured, stepping forward with the careful diplomacy of a man who'd survived 3 decades at court. "The girl is clearly a servant." "The girl," the Alpha King said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that somehow commanded more attention than shouting, "is exactly who I intended to address, and I suggest everyone remember that when questioning my decisions, you question the crown itself." The Duke stepped back as if slapped, and the assembled nobles seemed to shrink into themselves. 20 years of absolute rule had earned the Alpha King a reputation for patience, until that patience ended. Then consequences followed swift as lightning. In the servants' quarters 3 floors below, Mira pressed her face into her thin pillow and tried to muffle the sounds of her breaking heart. She'd stopped crying, there were no tears left, but the hollow ache in her chest felt like it might consume her entirely. Every breath hurt. Every thought circled back to the moment of recognition, to the pity in his dark eyes, to Elena's laughter echoing through the ballroom like breaking glass. A knock on her door made her freeze. Then Martha's voice, unusually gentle. "Mira, dear, there are guards here to see you." Guards. They'd come to arrest her for presumption, probably, or maybe just to escort her off the palace grounds before she could embarrass the crown further. She sat up slowly, wiping her face with shaking hands, and opened the door to find 2 royal guards in dress uniform, not the rough soldiers who handled criminals, but the elite who served the Alpha King directly. "Miss Mira?" The taller guard's voice held careful respect that confused her. "His Majesty requests your presence in the throne room." "I think there's been a mistake," she whispered. "I'm nobody important." "His Majesty was very specific," the guard said gently. "He's waiting for you." The walk back through the palace corridors felt like a death march. Servants pressed themselves against walls as the guards escorted her past, their faces mixtures of curiosity and sympathy. Word travelled fast in the servant quarters. Everyone would know by now that the bastard girl had somehow caught the king's attention and was about to face the consequences. They entered the throne room through the main doors this time, not the servants' entrance. The vast space echoed with their footsteps, empty except for the Alpha King who stood before his throne rather than sitting upon it. The gold and sapphire crown caught the torchlight, but his expression was unreadable in the flickering shadows. "Leave us," he commanded the guards, who bowed and withdrew. The doors closed with a finality that made Mira's stomach clench. They stood in silence for a long moment, king and servant, separated by 30 feet of marble and a gulf of social hierarchy that felt infinite. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than she'd expected. "I've been looking for you." The words were exactly what he'd said in the garden, but they carried different weight now. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, not daring to look at him directly. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I never meant to deceive you. I didn't know who you were, and I should have—" "Look at me." The command was quiet but absolute. Slowly, reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet his. What she saw there stole her breath. Not pity, not anger, but something fierce and protective that made no sense at all. "You never lied to me," he said, taking a step closer. "Not once. You told me exactly who you were, a woman who reads poetry in towers, who dreams of belonging somewhere, who's kind to people who don't deserve it. You told me your name, your hopes, your fears. What did I tell you that wasn't true?" The question caught her off guard. "Nothing, but—" "Then neither of us lied. We simply didn't share information that wasn't relevant to what mattered." "Not relevant?" The words burst out of her before she could stop them. "You're the Alpha King. I'm a servant. How is that not relevant?" "Because," he said, moving closer still, "when I held your hand in that garden, I wasn't holding the hand of a servant. I was holding the hand of a woman who dances like she's been waiting her whole life to fly. When we talked about poetry and dreams and the way you see the world, I wasn't talking to your social status. I was talking to you." "But I'm nobody," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. "Elena was right. I'm a bastard daughter who got ideas above her station. I don't belong in your world." "Elena," he said, and she'd never heard her half-sister's name spoken like a curse before, "is a cruel woman who mistakes cruelty for strength, and she's wrong about you. Completely, utterly wrong." He was close enough now that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could smell the cedar and rain scent that had haunted her dreams. "Do you know what I saw when I watched you serve wine to those nobles tonight?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I saw someone who moved with grace under pressure. Someone who was kind even when she was suffering. Someone who dropped a tray because she was shocked to see me, not because she was clumsy." His voice grew softer, more intense. "I saw the woman I've been talking to every morning for a week, and I realized that I knew her better than I've known anyone in my life." "Your Majesty." "My name," he said, "is Adrian. I told you that the second morning, when you asked what you should call me." "I can't call you by your name," she protested. "It wouldn't be proper." "Neither was dancing with me in the garden, but you did it anyway. Neither was telling me your dreams, but you shared them with me." He reached out slowly, carefully, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers traced her cheek with impossible gentleness. "Neither was making me fall in love with you, but that happened too." Her breath stopped entirely. "You can't mean that." "I can, and I do." His other hand came up to frame her face, and she found herself caught between his palms like something precious. "I've been looking for you my entire life, Mira. Not a princess or a duchess or a politically advantageous wife. You. The woman who reads poetry and dreams of mattering to someone and sees beauty in everything around her. I'm not worthy of you." The words came out broken, desperate. "Look at me. Look at what I am." "I am looking at you." His voice held fierce certainty. "I'm looking at someone brave enough to meet a stranger in gardens, someone who works without complaint even when she's treated cruelly, someone who dances like an angel and thinks she's nothing special." His thumbs brushed away tears she didn't realize were falling. I'm looking at the woman I want to spend the rest of my life protecting and cherishing and loving. The court will never accept me. Your advisers will say you've lost your mind. I don't know how to be a queen." "The court will accept what I tell them to accept," he said with quiet authority. "My advisers serve at my pleasure, not the other way around, and as for being a queen, you've been leading with kindness and grace your entire life. That's the only qualification that matters." He stepped back then, but only to drop to one knee before her. From somewhere in his jacket he produced a ring, not the heavy signet she'd expected, but something simpler, more beautiful. A single diamond surrounded by sapphires that caught the torchlight like captured stars. "Mirror of House Blackthorn," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the vast throne room. "Bastard daughter, servant, dreamer, the most beautiful woman I've ever known. Will you marry me?" The question hit her like a physical blow. "I can't. I'm not. I don't—" "Will you marry me?" he repeated, patient as he'd been in every garden conversation. "Not because you think you should, but because you want to, because you love me the way I love you." And God help her, she did love him, loved his gentle hands and patient voice and the way he looked at her like she was something miraculous, loved their morning conversations and the safety she felt in his presence, and the impossible feeling that with him she could be brave enough to fly. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Yes?" He smiled then, bright as sunrise, and slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly. "Say it again. Louder." "Yes," she said, stronger this time. "Yes, I'll marry you." He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around the throne room like they were dancing in the garden again. When he set her down, his hands were gentle on her face, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you," he said simply, "not in spite of who you are, but because of it. You're everything I've been searching for, Mira, everything." "I love you too," she admitted, the words feeling like confession and absolution all at once. "I've loved you since that first night in the garden, even when I thought it was impossible." "Nothing's impossible," he said, and kissed her with infinite tenderness. "Not any more." When they broke apart, he kept her close, his arms around her waist like he was afraid she might disappear. "What happens now?" she asked, overwhelmed by the magnitude of everything that had changed in the span of an hour. "Now," he said, his smile warm with promise, "we go back to that ballroom and I introduce the court to their future queen, and anyone who has a problem with my choice can take it up with me directly." The thought of facing those hundreds of nobles again, of seeing Elena's shock and the court's judgment, made her stomach clench with anxiety. But Adrian's steady presence beside her, his hand warm and sure in hers, made it seem possible, more than possible. "Right. Together?" she asked. "Always," he promised, and led her toward the doors that would open onto the rest of their lives. The days that followed were like living in a dream she was afraid to wake from. The court's reaction to Adrian's announcement had been everything Mira expected and nothing she was prepared for. Shocked silence, followed by carefully measured congratulations, followed by the kind of frantic political manoeuvring that happened when the social order shifted overnight. But Adrian had stood beside her through all of it, his hand steady on her back, his presence an anchor in the storm of whispered conversations and calculating glances. Elena had left the palace that very night, escorted by royal guards to the family estate, with instructions not to return until specifically invited. "She will not have another opportunity to harm you," Adrian had told Mira quietly, and something in his voice suggested that Eleanor's exile was the merciful option. Father had arrived 3 days later, suddenly eager to acknowledge the bastard daughter he'd barely spoken to in 20 years. Mira had met with him in the formal receiving room, dressed in silk the colour of winter sky and wearing Adrian's ring on her finger like armour. "My dear," Father had said, his smile wide and false as fool's gold, "I always knew you were destined for great things." "No," Mira had replied, her voice steady with newfound strength, "you didn't, and that's all right. But I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't let you profit from the connection you refuse to nurture." She'd given him a modest pension and a small estate in the countryside, enough to live comfortably, but far from court and its temptations. It was more kindness than he deserved, but Adrian had taught her that strength could afford to be generous. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of gentle instruction and careful integration into palace life. Adrian was endlessly patient as she learned the intricate protocols of court, never making her feel foolish for not knowing which fork to use at state dinners or how deeply to curtsy to visiting dignitaries. The palace staff, taking their cues from their king's obvious devotion, treated her with respect that still felt miraculous. But the real magic happened in the quiet moments between official duties. Their morning meetings in the garden continued, no longer secret but somehow still precious. They would walk the paths as dawn painted the sky in pastels, talking about everything and nothing while the rest of the palace slowly woke around them. Adrian brought her books, first editions of poetry collections, histories of the kingdom she would help rule, philosophical treatises that challenged her mind and made her think in new ways. "You don't have to read all of these," he said one morning, gesturing to the growing stack on the garden bench. "I just want you to have access to whatever interests you." "I want to understand," she told him, running her fingers over the leather binding of a volume on statecraft. "Your world, our world. I don't want to be the queen who smiles and looks pretty while others make the real decisions." The pride in his eyes made her feel like she could conquer kingdoms. Their evenings together were equally precious. After the day's formal duties ended, they would retreat to Adrian's private study, a warm room lined with books and maps, dominated by a fireplace that cast dancing shadows across worn leather chairs. Sometimes they read separately, comfortable in shared silence. Sometimes Adrian handled correspondence, while Mira worked on her own letters to village leaders, learning the delicate art of royal communication. Sometimes they simply talked, continuing conversations that had started in moonlit gardens and would probably continue for the rest of their lives. "What are you thinking about?" Adrian asked one evening, looking up from a trade agreement to find her staring into the fire with a distant expression. "The girl in the blue dress," Mira said softly, "the one who watched the ballroom from the servants' corridor and thought beautiful things weren't for her. I keep wondering what I would tell her if I could go back." "What would you tell her?" "That she already belonged. She just hadn't found her people yet." Adrian set aside his papers and moved to the chair beside hers, taking her hands in his with the gentle reverence she was learning to expect. "She found them, though, eventually." "She did?" Mira squeezed his fingers, marvelling at the calluses she'd discovered there, evidence that even kings sometimes worked with their hands. She found everything she was afraid to hope for. The wedding was planned for the first day of spring, small by royal standards, but perfect for them. Instead of a massive cathedral ceremony designed to impress foreign dignitaries, they chose the palace garden where they'd first danced. Instead of hundreds of nobles selected for political advantage, they invited the people who actually mattered: palace staff who had shown Mira kindness, village leaders Adrian respected, the handful of nobles who had proven themselves worthy of trust. Martha served as Mira's attendant, weeping openly as she helped fasten the pearl buttons on a gown that transformed Mira into something ethereal. The dress was ivory silk that caught sunlight like captured clouds, with sleeves that flowed like water and a train that whispered against stone paths. Adrian's mother's tiara, a delicate thing of diamonds and pearls, sat light as air on her carefully arranged hair. "You look like a queen," Martha said through happy tears. "I feel like me," Mira replied, and meant it. Just the best possible version. The ceremony itself was everything she'd dreamed and nothing she'd expected. Adrian waited for her by the fountain where they'd first danced, dressed in formal blue that made his eyes look like captured stars. When he saw her walking down the petal-strewn path, his expression transformed into something so tender it took her breath away. Their vows were personal, written in their own words, rather than recited from ancient traditions. Adrian promised to love her courage as much as her kindness, to protect her dreams as fiercely as her person, to build a kingdom where people like her, people who started with nothing, could find their way to everything. Mira promised to stand beside him in strength and gentleness, to help him lead with wisdom and compassion, to remind him every day that true power came from lifting others up rather than holding them down. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, king and queen, Adrian's kiss tasted like spring rain and promises kept. The celebration afterward was joyful rather than formal. Music that made people dance instead of simply listen. Food that prioritized flavor over presentation. Conversations that mattered more than political maneuvering. Mira found herself laughing until her cheeks ached, dancing until her feet protested, surrounded by people who saw her worth and celebrated it genuinely. "Happy?" Adrian asked during a quiet moment, as they swayed together to music that drifted from the pavilion. "Impossibly so," she admitted against his shoulder. "I keep thinking someone's going to tell me it's all been a mistake." "The only mistake," he said, tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes, "would be not believing that you deserve every bit of this happiness." 6 months after the wedding, on an autumn evening when the garden roses bloomed in defiant profusion, Mira sat in their private study working on correspondence while Adrian reviewed Treasury reports. The fire crackled in the grate, and somewhere in the palace musicians practiced for the next day's harvest festival. "I got a letter from the village school today," Mira said, setting down her pen with satisfaction. 3 more girls have enrolled since we started the scholarship fund, including 2 from families that couldn't afford to send them before. Adrian looked up from his papers, his smile warm with shared pride. "How many does that make total?" 47 this year, 47 girls who might have spent their lives believing they didn't matter, getting the chance to learn that they do. Like their queen did. Like their queen did. She moved to sit on the arm of his chair, and he immediately wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer. "Do you ever regret it? Not choosing someone who already knew how to be royal?" "Never," he said without hesitation. "I chose the woman who makes me want to be worthy of the crown, not the woman who would have looked good wearing it beside me. There's a difference." "I love you," she said, the words as easy now as breathing. "I love you too. Every day I choose you, and every day I'm grateful you chose me back." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching firelight dance across the walls of the room that had become their sanctuary. Outside, the kingdom they ruled together continued its gentle progress toward justice and kindness. In villages across the realm, children learned to read regardless of their parents' wealth. In palace halls, decisions were made with compassion as well as wisdom. In 100 small ways, the love they'd found in a moonlit garden was transforming the world around them. "What are you thinking about now?" Adrian asked, noticing her distant expression. "Tomorrow," Mira said, settling more comfortably against his side, "and the day after that, and all the days we get to spend building something beautiful together." "Sounds perfect to me." And as autumn wind whispered through garden roses and firelight painted their faces in gold, the bastard daughter who had become a queen allowed herself to believe, finally and completely, that she had found her place in the world. Before we continue, please take 2 seconds to like this video if you're enjoying this story. It really helps support the channel and lets me know what content you want to see more of. They built a love that transformed not just their lives, but everyone who witnessed it. A reminder that worth isn't determined by birth or station, but by the courage to believe you deserve to be cherished, and the wisdom to choose someone who sees your value, even when you can't see it yourself. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments and talk about what love story you'd like to hear next.